A baby grizzly bear, lost in the middle of a raging snowstorm, was alone, starving and freezing. The cub had nowhere to go, no mother to guide it, no den to shield it from the biting cold. Its tiny body trembled as it stumbled through knee-deep snow, its cries drowned out by the howling wind. It seemed like all hope was lost for the fragile creature. But then, through the icy haze, the cub spotted movement. A man trudging through the wilderness, his silhouette barely visible against the storm. Desperation overtook fear, and the cub did something no one could have predicted. It followed him. For 6 grueling miles, the tiny bear trailed behind the stranger, its weak cries barely audible over the roar of the blizzard. The man turned around at one point, and what he did next shocked everyone. This is a story of survival, an unbreakable bond, and a moment that would change both their lives forever. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happens next. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing through the endless white expanse of Wyoming's backcountry. Heavy snow blanketed the forest, burying everything in an unforgiving silence. It was the kind of storm that could swallow anything in its path: trees, animals, even the strongest men. Ethan Carter, a seasoned wildlife researcher, pulled his coat tighter around his body as he trudged through the thick snow. He had spent the morning tracking a group of elk near Yellowstone National Park, but now, with visibility dropping to near zero, he knew he needed to turn back. His cabin was still miles away, and the temperature was plummeting fast. Then he heard it, a faint cry. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but then it came again, a weak, desperate whimper. Ethan stopped, his breath visible in the freezing air. He scanned the storm, searching for the source of the sound. And then, just a few feet away, he saw it. A tiny grizzly cub, barely bigger than a golden retriever, struggling through the snow. Its fur was soaked and matted with ice, and the little bear was utterly alone. No mother in sight. Ethan's chest tightened. A grizzly cub this small wouldn't survive the night, not in a storm like this. The cub locked eyes with him, its gaze filled with fear, exhaustion, and a silent plea. Ethan knew better than to interfere with nature. If a cub was alone, it usually meant the mother had abandoned it, or worse, had been killed. A mother bear would never willingly leave her cub behind. But as Ethan stood there, the cub took a shaky step toward him, then another. "This is insane," Ethan muttered under his breath. He hesitated, torn between instinct and desperation. Taking in a wild animal went against everything he believed in. Yet, looking at this shivering scrap of life before him, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Not yet. He sighed deeply, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "You're going to make this hard, aren't you?" he muttered under his breath. The cub tilted its head, as if considering his words, then let out another pitiful whine. Ethan knelt down, extending a gloved hand cautiously. The cub sniffed it, its nose twitching curiously. Then, without warning, it collapsed onto the wet earth, too weak to stand any longer. Ethan cursed softly under his breath. He glanced around, knowing full well the dangers lurking in these woods. Predators wouldn't hesitate to prey on such a vulnerable creature. If he left it here, it would die. With a resigned groan, Ethan scooped the cub into his arms, cradling it against his chest. Its heartbeat fluttered weakly beneath his fingers, a reminder of how fragile life could be. Wrapping it in his raincoat, he continued walking, determined to find refuge before nightfall. Hours later, Ethan arrived at his cabin nestled deep within the forest. He kicked open the door, letting warmth spill out into the cold evening air. Inside, the scent of wood smoke lingered, and the soft glow of lantern light illuminated the cozy space. Carefully, he placed the cub near the fireplace, wrapping it in a thick blanket. Its breathing was shallow but steady, and for the first time since finding it, Ethan allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Over the next few days, Ethan nursed the cub back to health. He fed it scraps of meat and warmed milk, watching as its strength slowly returned. The once frail creature began to grow, its coat becoming sleek and shiny, its movements more confident. But as much as Ethan tried to remind himself that this was temporary, that he couldn't keep it forever, he couldn't deny the bond forming between them. The cub followed him everywhere, wagging its tail and nuzzling his hand whenever he sat still long enough. One morning, Ethan woke to find the cub sitting by the window, staring out at the forest beyond. Its ears perked up at every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. It was ready, he realized, ready to return to where it belonged. His chest tightened at the thought of letting go, but he knew it was the right thing to do. That afternoon, he led the cub to the edge of the woods, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Kneeling beside it, he rested a hand on its head. "This is your home," he said softly. "You're strong enough now. You'll be okay." The cub looked at him, its amber eyes filled with trust, and perhaps a hint of sadness. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, slowly, it turned toward the trees and took its first steps into the wilderness. Ethan watched until it disappeared from view, tears streaming down his face. Weeks passed, and though the cabin felt emptier than ever, Ethan found solace in knowing he had done the right thing. One day, while hiking near the cabin, he heard a familiar sound, a low, rumbling bark. Turning, he saw the bear standing at the edge of the clearing, larger and stronger now, but unmistakably the same cub he had saved. It gazed at him for a long moment before disappearing back into the forest. Ethan smiled through his tears. This wasn't goodbye. It was proof that love sometimes means giving someone the freedom to thrive. And in that moment, he understood that the bond they shared would endure, even across the vast expanse of the wild. The storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Ethan had faced many challenges in his years as a wildlife researcher, but nothing quite like this. The snowstorm seemed alive, almost sentient, as if it were determined to erase every trace of life from the landscape. Trees bent under the weight of the snow, their branches snapping with sharp cracks that echoed through the forest. The wind screamed through the trees, carrying with it a biting chill that seeped into Ethan's bones despite his heavy coat. As he trudged forward, the tiny cub trailing behind him, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the resilience of the creature. How had it survived this far? Cubs were entirely dependent on their mothers for food, warmth, and protection during their first year of life. Without her, the odds were overwhelmingly against it. Yet here it was, still moving, still fighting, even as its tiny body shook with exhaustion. Ethan's mind raced with questions. What had happened to the mother? Had she been killed by hunters or predators? Or had she succumbed to the storm herself? Whatever the reason, the cub was now orphaned, left to fend for itself in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Ethan knew the harsh truth of nature, survival of the fittest. But as he glanced back at the cub, he felt something stir within him, something deeper than logic or reason. Compassion. Back at the cabin, Ethan worked tirelessly to nurse the cub back to health. He prepared makeshift meals using whatever supplies he had on hand: dried berries, softened jerky, and even some honey he'd brought along for energy. The cub ate greedily at first, its hunger overriding its natural caution. But as the days passed, it began to regain its strength, its movements becoming less clumsy and more deliberate. Ethan observed the cub closely, noting its behavior and instincts. Despite its young age, it already displayed traits typical of grizzlies: curiosity, playfulness, and a fierce determination to explore its surroundings. One afternoon, Ethan watched as the cub pawed at a pile of leaves, scattering them across the floor in search of hidden treasures. Another time, it chased after a moth that had flown into the cabin, batting it clumsily with its paws. These moments reminded Ethan of the cub's innate wildness, a reminder that it was not meant to live among humans, yet the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. The cub seemed to sense Ethan's care and protection, often curling up beside him when it slept, or nudging him affectionately when it wanted attention. Ethan found himself talking to the cub as if it were a person, sharing stories about his adventures in the wild and the lessons he had learned from studying animals. Though the cub couldn't understand his words, it listened intently, its dark eyes fixed on him. Despite the joy the cub brought into his life, Ethan knew he couldn't keep it forever. Grizzlies were apex predators, designed to roam vast territories and dominate their ecosystems. Keeping the cub in captivity would rob it of its true nature and potential. But the thought of letting it go filled Ethan with dread. How could he send it back into the wild, knowing the dangers it would face? Determined to give the cub the best chance at survival, Ethan devised a plan. Over the coming weeks, he began teaching it essential skills it would need to thrive in the wild. He started by introducing it to different types of food, encouraging it to forage for roots and berries in the surrounding forest. At first, the cub was hesitant, unsure of what to eat or how to dig. But with patience and guidance, it gradually learned to identify edible plants and use its claws to unearth buried treats. Next, Ethan focused on honing the cub's hunting instincts. He led it to a nearby stream where fish darted through the crystal-clear water. The cub watched intently as Ethan demonstrated how to catch them, swiping at the surface with quick, precise movements. Though it missed more often than it succeeded, the cub's persistence paid off. One day, it managed to snag a small trout, proudly carrying it back to Ethan as if seeking approval. Ethan also taught the cub about danger. He introduced it to the scents and sounds of potential threats, such as wolves and mountain lions, helping it recognize when to retreat and when to stand its ground. During one particularly memorable lesson, Ethan simulated an attack by throwing a stick toward the cub. Startled, it reared up on its hind legs, baring its teeth and growling fiercely. Though still small, the cub's display of courage left Ethan both proud and humbled. As spring approached, the cub transformed before Ethan's eyes. Its once tiny frame had grown robust, its golden fur shining in the sunlight. It moved with confidence now, its playful antics replaced by a quiet intensity that spoke of its readiness to face the world on its own. Yet, despite its newfound independence, the cub remained affectionate toward Ethan, often seeking him out for companionship or comfort. The day finally came when Ethan knew it was time. Standing at the edge of the forest, he knelt beside the cub, resting a hand on its thick fur. "You know what to do, buddy," he murmured. you're ready." The cub turned its head slightly, those deep, dark eyes locking onto his. Ethan swallowed hard. He had told himself he was prepared for this moment, that this had always been the plan. But now that it was here, it felt like something was being ripped from his chest. "You have to go now," Ethan said gently. "This is your home." The cub blinked, its ears twitching slightly. For a long moment, it didn't move. And then, finally, slowly, it turned toward the forest. Ethan watched as it took its first steps away from him, its claws sinking into the dirt. It paused once, glancing back. Ethan didn't say anything. He just nodded. And then, just like that, the cub disappeared into the trees. Ethan stood there long after it was gone, staring at the place where it had vanished. He had done the right thing. The bear was where it was meant to be. But why did it hurt so much? He turned to head back to the cabin, trying to push down the ache in his chest. And then he heard it. A low, familiar rumbling sound. He stopped, turned, and there at the tree line the cub stood once more. It didn't come back to him. It didn't move forward. But it did something Ethan would never forget. It let out a deep, rolling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. A sound of trust, of gratitude, a goodbye. And then the cub turned and disappeared once more, this time for good. Ethan stood there in silence, a lump forming in his throat. The cabin had never felt so empty before. But this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Somewhere out there in the wild, where it belonged, a grizzly bear was growing stronger, wiser, ready to face the world on its own. And Ethan, he would never forget the little soul that had followed him through the storm, begging for help, and the moment he had realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go.